Today, I'm going to talk about my favorite proof for the existence of God. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. When I say my favorite proof for the existence of God, I want to clarify, I don't mean the proof I think is the easiest to follow or the most persuasive, but rather it's the proof for the existence of God which tells us the most about God. Now, and it's actually a little bit interrelated with another one. So I may actually mention two of them. But it's the argument from contingency and necessity, which you find as the third proof. Pretty sure it's the third proof. The second proof. I'm a little rusty at the moment. In St. Thomas's Summa Theologica. And the argument from contingency and necessity is basically as follows. That you can tell that you yourself are contingent, that you don't have to exist. Or, heck, you can actually even apply this to the argument itself. The words forming the argument don't necessarily exist because they didn't a moment ago, and as you are making the argument, the words that made up the beginning no longer exist, and the words that make up the end do. People will talk about the B theory of time. I'll address that later. That's not a useful objection here. So, in this, you can see that these things are contingent, that they do not have to necessarily exist. Because if something necessarily has to exist, it can't not exist, because not existing is the opposite of necessarily existing. Now, this is a contingent thing. Why does it therefore exist? Its existence is contingent upon something else. In the case of, say, like me talking, the words in the air are contingent upon me forming them. So this is the relationship of contingency. They exist because of the thing that I did. Now, I am either necessary or contingent. If I am contingent, then I am contingent on something else. Now, here's the thing. People often work this backwards in time. That's not the direction to go with it. This is the same, actually, problem exists in how people interpret the argument from change, often called the argument from motion, that they try to trace things back in time. That's not what the potentiality and actuality is about. And that's not, in this argument, the important part of contingency and necessity. I am here contingent on something. I don't exist by my own power because I have the ability to not exist. Moreover, I have different parts that can obviously exist separately from me. You can cut off my hands and I continue to exist, etc. There are various aspects to me that obviously do not have to exist. So I am contingent and push this back. Now, we are most familiar with temporal contingency. Like, I exist because my parents made me, and they exist because their parents made them, and so on. So usually this argument, at least what I've seen, tends to be illustrated with temporal contingency. But that's not the important part. The important part is actually not the temporal contingency of it, but the immediate contingency of it. I don't necessarily exist in this moment, certainly not by my own power. I'm here in this moment because of something else that isn't me. And I am put together in this way because of powers that are not my own. And so it's actually in the moment that you draw this very immediately, and you can see very clearly this can't be an infinite chain of contingency because then nothing would actually be actualizing it. And you can't say the reason I'm here is something, and the reason it's making me here is something, and the reason it's making me here is something, and just keep on going and never stop because you don't have any actuality in the entire thing. People can be this doesn't work actually for temporal causation either. You can't have an infinite sequence that stops, which is what would in fact happen if you tried to do this temporally, but very few people understand that point, and it doesn't really matter because it's immediate causation, not temporal causation, that really is the issue here. Why am I here and not here in the moment? Not what sequence of things led up to me, but why am I here versus not here? There's got to be something whose power is sustaining my existence, because it isn't my power, and so on. So if it's something else where it's not its power, it's got to be something, and there's got to be something who's actually providing the power of existence to me in this moment, for me to exist in this moment. Otherwise, I'm not here. Now, that thing, there must be some non-contingent thing. That non-contingent thing, all men call God, as St. Thomas put it. Now, this tells us that God, unlike creation, is necessary. Now, this tells us actually so this shows us that God exists. But it actually tells us quite a lot about God as well, which is why this is my favorite proof for the existence of God. As a quick caveat, I've seen some interesting terms for it, but essentially, when I talk about God, I'm talking about, I'm talking about the necessary source of the existence of all contingency. I'm talking about, as Bishop Barron puts it, ultimate reality. I am not talking about like some big powerful guy up in the clouds, or I'm told, I read somewhere that D.B. Hart called it monopolytheism. And so I'm not talking about a being that just happens to be a very big being, but rather something whose existence is utterly unlike us and is the reason why we are here. Now, if God necessarily exists, there are a bunch of things that follow from this about God. And this, and what we're getting to right here, is why this is my favorite proof for the existence of God. So, one of the things that we know is that God necessarily is not composed of parts. Because parts, that is to say, parts which are capable of independent existence. Because parts that are capable of independent existence, like my right hand and my left hand, although I realize it's probably flipped from your perspective. But my right hand and my left hand can exist independently of each other. You could cut the one off and cut the other off, and they're in two separate places, and they exist. I could completely destroy my right hand, utterly burn it in fire, and my left hand is still right there. They're capable of independent existence, and something conjoins these two things together into one human being. Not that I'm the sum of it, just onto the human being as part of the human being. God does not have parts in this sense. God is simple in this sense, because for parts that can exist separately to exist together, something must be joining them. Now, if something is joining parts that can exist separately, their connection is contingent on the thing joining them. But God is not contingent, God is necessary. Therefore, God is simple. Now, remember that the simplicity of God is more complex than the complexity of human beings, in a metaphorical sense. Because some people, when they hear that God is simple, they think like, oh, God must be like a single idea in my head. And no, that's not what we mean by simple. Simple in this sense means not composed of separable parts, not something very easy to think or something very easy to comprehend. And so, God is simple. Now, what this has many more consequences. So, for example, one of them is that God does not lack anything. Since God has no parts, God exists necessarily, God is not lacking anything. There is nothing that could be part of God's complete being which is not there. So God is perfectly happy. Now, because to be happy is to have the fullness of your being. To miss something, to be missing some part of yourself, is to be unhappy. This is just contemplate the idea of happiness and unhappiness for a moment, and you will see that completeness of being is what happiness consists of, and lacking something is necessary for unhappiness. God lacks nothing, and God is therefore happy. Now, this tells us something about the relationship of God to creation, because creation can add nothing to God, because God is not composed of parts that any more parts could be added to God. God is also perfectly happy, so creation cannot be done for God's sake, because God lacks nothing. So the relationship of God to creation is one of pure gift. God creates creation for creation's sake, because creation is the only thing capable of receiving more. Creation is the only thing for which there exists the logical possibility of it being benefited. You will find, by the way, a bunch of metaphorical language talking about like giving things to God or whatever, but when you work it through, it's all metaphorical language. And for the most part, except for idiots, nobody actually thinks when you say, for example, give glory to God, that you are in some way improving God or making God better or adding to God in some way. When you give glory to God, this is a metaphor for various things about having a proper relationship to God and possibly sharing knowledge about the Creator with the rest of creation. But it is not in no way about actually adding anything to God. So it is with all that language. It's all metaphor for things having a right ordering within creation. So the relationship between God and creation is one of pure gift. Or, to use a somewhat more common word for pure gift, is one of love. God loves the world into existence. God creates the world so that God can give more to the world. And this is intrinsic in the nature of God. When we say, when we say God is love, that's where I was going with that. This is what's meant. God, love in this sense is generosity. As Bishop Barron likes to use the phrase, willing the good of the other as other. I slightly prefer willing the good of the other for the other's sake, is sort of, I actually like that better. But either way, any way you put it, that love is generosity. Love is gift. Love is that sort of free gift where it's not in any sense for the sake of the giver, but all for the sake of the recipient. So we know that God loves us. Now, this, by the way, so you can kind of see where, like, we're starting to find a bunch of useful and important properties of God in the way that, for example, the argument from the governance of the world, which I don't know if that video is going to come out before or after this, but I really like that because it's actually one of the easier arguments to understand, but it doesn't tell you very much about God because the world is too complex to understand towards what precisely its governance is directed. And so you can't figure out that much about the Creator, and a superficial viewing where there's pain and suffering and so on can actually rather mislead you about what the governance of the world is about. And so that's why that proof, though it is, I think, the most accessible of the proofs in natural philosophy for the existence of God, natural theology for the existence of God, is by no means, I think, it's not my favorite, and it's not really the most helpful. Like, I don't think that's a good place to stop. Well, I mean, obviously, you should go on all the way and become Christian and so on. But anyway, you don't get to Christianity through natural philosophy. And I'm just talking about where you do get to through natural theology. And I'm just talking here about where you get through natural theology. Christianity involves revelation and the disclosure to us of things that we can't get to by natural theology, in which God has to specifically tell us. So, when it comes to things that we learn about God, so we know that God is simple, we know that God is necessary, simple, happy, and love. That God loves the world. And so there are other things. We also know that God is outside of time, because time involves change, and change is the actualization of being. So we know that God is outside of time as well. And so this tells us a lot about the Creator of all that is, or all that contingently is. This tells us about the Creator of creation, in that God is, to us, like a human parent, incidentally, although it's a very imperfect relationship, a very imperfect analogy, pardon me, because human parents can benefit from their children, and God can't benefit from us. But at the same time, a human child can't do anything to deserve being created. That's something that sort of just is given to it by its parents, and we stand in that relationship to God, that we can't just do anything to deserve being created from God, because you can't do something without existing. So I mean, it's a little obvious, but worth saying. So this, there are other things that you can work out too, but these are the big ones, and to me, the most important ones. Understanding that relationship where we don't add anything to God, that God is, you also get from this, by the way, God's knowledge of us. That God's knowledge of us is, again, because we are all contingent on God for our existence in the moment, that we are one of the things that God is doing in the moment. God is outside of time, of course, but the moment is dependent upon God. And so God's knowledge of us is shown to be an extremely intimate one, because everything that exists is being sustained in its existence by the power of God. And so you can I'm not going to work the whole thing out, because this one's a bit longer. It occupies a bunch of questions in the Summa Theologica. But it also at least is a sketch of how God is omniscient and knows absolutely everything, because we're all contingent upon God. We are all an active act of God. One other thing too is, it makes the omnipotence of God very obvious, because of course we're all dependent on God for our existence in every moment. So it's kind of obviously of our nature, or obviously of the nature of this relationship, that anything that can exist in a logically coherent sense, God can do, because anything that all does exist is what God is doing. So it also just sort of clarifies that creation relationship. It's a really good analogy to this one. All analogies are imperfect, but a really good one is actually that of an author to the author's characters, that Shakespeare is omniscient and omnipotent with regard to the characters that he writes within his play. So that we stand in that sort of relationship to God. So this is not all of it, but this is enough for the moment, I think, because this is, as far as my memory is carrying me, this is all the really big stuff of telling us about our relationship to God. And so this will actually also be very useful if you when you take the next step in this from natural theology to asking, okay, so do any of the religions of the world actually add anything to natural theology? And so then you can look at the various religions of the world, how many of them even get this much right, and then how many of them are compatible with this. And among those that are compatible with it, you can then sort of pare it down to those that are compatible with what you can learn through natural theology, through the exercise of reason upon creation alone. And then you can weed down very quickly the things to consider where people are claiming that there has been some special revelation from God to humanity, that only those that are compatible with what you can know through the exercise of reason are really particularly worth considering. The alternative is of course, if you're going to reject reason, then fine, whatever. At that point, well, there's no reasonable way to proceed if your starting point is rejecting reason. So if you hold that, human reason is useless for understanding the world, and so it's only, well, at that point, stop talking, because language is intrinsically rational. That's the reason why the Greek word logos meant both word, thought, rationality, argument, logic. It meant all of these things because they're all related concepts. To speak is to imply a rational relationship between the things being spoken of. So, if you're going to reject reason, then stop talking and break out the theremins, you can hear them in the Star Trek theme song. I don't do a great rendition of a theremin. They modulate a sine wave by inductance or capacitance or something like that, induced by you being near a coil, and so you can generate, you can influence this to change its pitch by moving your hand around, and so it's a curious musical instrument, popular for a little while, but has a very eerie sort of sound, which is why I say break out the theremins. Anyway, so that is why this is my favorite proof for the existence of God. You get similar things, by the way, out of the argument for motion or change, that God is pure actuality, and if God is pure actuality, then basically being pure actuality and necessarily existing are very related to each other. There's some technical details. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're closely related, and you can get similar things out of pure actuality, except the concept of actual versus potential is itself, you need a bunch of explanation in order for the concept of actual versus potential to really be clear in the way that it's used in the Aristotelian scholastic proofs for the existence of God in that way. So I don't want to get into it, although you can do similar things with it. And the two of them can be used together as well. Anyway, because anyhow, so there's that. Now, there's the asterisk I had mentioned all the way at the beginning, the B theory of time, which is, roughly speaking, that there isn't such thing as change, and there isn't a present moment, that instead all of the moments of time exist simultaneously to each other. And this comes, now, I mean, from a human perspective, this is just obviously false anyway. But the idea, so how they explain the existence of a moment, I don't know. To some degree, there is an element of, you can kind of work at this with like, there is, because you can't do something like a sliding window over what already exists, because then that would just be in its own time where there is a present moment. So it's that all of these moments exist simultaneously, and in each moment seems like the present to that moment, roughly speaking. And so you don't have any sort of potentiality. You only have pure actuality, and you don't have any sort of you don't have anything which is contingent, because absolutely everything just necessarily exists in this complex manifold of all the moments simultaneously existing to each other. Now, here's the thing about this. This doesn't get around the proof for the existence of God, because essentially all this is doing is looking at time from God's perspective. From God's perspective, all of the moments of creation exist in some sort of simultaneous sense, because every moment is dependent on its existence, for God. And all moments are present to God, that the past is not inaccessible to God, and the future is not inaccessible to God, because God exists in a timeless eternity outside of it. And so it's not like God has a succession of experiences of creation, that all of creation is eternally present to God. Very, very difficult to describe what that means, because God is so radically unlike us, and we have human language to describe the things of our experience, not things entirely outside of our experience. And the things inside of our experience can only sort of kind of point in the direction of fuller, more real things upon which our existence depends. So language is intrinsically limited, and it has to be. You cannot have language that can describe ultimate reality from within our contingent reality, because we have no experience of non-contingency, being ourselves contingent. Anyway, the problem here is to try to escape this proof by invoking God's perspective on time. It's still not getting away from contingency and necessity, because there must be something that conjoins these moments, just as the argument from change, the argument from motion, is that there must be something that is actual that is turning one moment into the next. As I said, people often mistake this for temporal causation, like what got things started, but that's not what the argument from motion is about. The argument from motion is about how is it that something changes at all? How does it go from being one thing to being something else? How do you have a next moment? It doesn't really change if you try to argue about moments being continuous rather than discrete. That doesn't affect the argument. There's got to be some way in which this change actually occurs, something that is actual, that is making this change actually occur. If you try to argue, oh, there is no change, there are just all of these moments that are conjoined, well, something put them together, because the moments don't contain each other. The moments are not all one thing. They are clearly distinct things that are together in some fashion, and so they all still depend on something else which is actual for their actuality, even if you want to shift perspectives from our perspective in the moment to God's perspective in eternity. It doesn't actually defeat the argument in any way. All you're doing, basically, is admitting God's existence and then trying to use God's existence to prove that God doesn't exist. You're admitting God's existence in order to step into God's perspective, and then you are trying to use God's perspective to show that God doesn't exist. It's highly technical, but if you understand the technicality of it, it becomes kind of funny, because this is a person who is... It's a little bit like the characters in the Looney Tunes cartoons who are sitting on a tree branch and then sawing vigorously at the branch. That the only hope you have for maintaining anything like the atheist worldview which you can't do rationally. But in any event, the only hope you have for doing anything even vaguely like it is to maintain some sort of, roughly speaking, either the infinite world, which really doesn't rationally work because you can't have a terminating infinite series. As I said, it's very technical, and I've run into very few people who really understand that point. Or some sort of cyclality is the typical way you can actually make this seem believable. And in neither of these things can you have a complete. In neither of these things can you have an eternal reality, because the eternal reality is precisely what you're actually trying to get away from. It's a curious thing. As I said, the technicalities involved are kind of long and complex, and I don't have time to get into them, and I don't think anyone has time for me to get into them now either. It's the sort of thing where you need to really start, look up an encyclopedia of philosophy and start tracing through and tracing back through the definitions until you kind of understand all of the terms and to what they signify, and that'll start to put you in a position to understand it in a really sort of fuller sense. Like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I think it is. There's a dictionary of philosophy. I'll try to remember to put a link to it, and if I don't, remind me. But anyway, there's some very useful dictionaries of philosophy that are a good place to get started on this, because doing it all is just long and complex and takes a lot of time. But the short outline sketch is essentially that if your objection to the argument from contingency and necessity is the B theory of time, all you are doing is looking at the world from God's perspective rather than from our perspective. And the only way you can justify the B theory of time is via this is God's perspective on time. And so, I mean, you don't have to call God God. You can call God something else in order to do this, which is kind of what people tend to do. But in any event, the thing that you're doing is you're saying, okay, there is some ultimate reality that then links all of these moments together, causing them to simultaneously exist. And so because of that, the argument that things are changing doesn't work. Well, you're only getting around it by presupposing God. You can't hold well, maybe things really exist as they do from God's perspective without holding God. You can't say that maybe there is actually some sort of necessary causation which holds all of the moments, which causes all of these manifold moments to exist without there being that necessary cause that causes these contingent moments to exist and causes the moments to be related to each other, unless there is some sort of pure act that is making all of these moments united to each other such that these moments are in fact related to each other. So the only way I've ever seen anyone try to get around this is basically through hand waving, which is, let's ignore how this is the case. Let's only focus on this one very narrow thing and how it is a problem for this argument. But at that point, the moment we say that this is a problem for the argument, we're going to stop thinking right now, no more thinking about it. And it's not a valid argument. You can't tell people to think only this, but then stop and don't actually logically follow things through to their conclusions. So, the argument that God exists, therefore God doesn't exist, is not very good, unless you are writing a comedy novel about, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Like that one man then went on to prove that up is down, right is left, and black is white, and then died at the nearest zebra crossing. That was the one where it was from the Babelfish, that the Babelfish was so obviously useful. It was a dead giveaway that God exists, but within this argument there can't be absolute proof, and therefore, because there's something that clearly and unambiguously proves that God exists, God doesn't exist. And it's funny. Douglas Adams is a funny man, not a great logician if you ever see him trying any actual logic, but a very funny man. And I've got a video on his puddle logic. He's not very good at it, but really, really funny. And this basically, invoking the B theory of time, is more or less on par with the argument for God's non-existence from the Babelfish, because the Babelfish proves God exists. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.